Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It all started with a feeling. A sensation that lingered in the air, that clung to my skin like the chill of a forgotten storm. Every touch, every breath, seemed to carry with it a curse I couldn't shake. At first, it was just a faint whisper, a fleeting sense of unease, but as the days wore on, it grew heavier. The air around me felt thick, charged with an unknown force, pulling me deeper into a sense of inevitability. The house I lived in was nothing extraordinary. It was an old building, nestled at the edge of the city. A small, quiet place that should have been a sanctuary, but now it felt suffocating, like a trap closing in around me. The walls groaned in the silence, and the floorboards creaked in the stillness. The windows rattled at night, as if something was out there, waiting, watching. But that wasn't the worst of it. It was the feeling. The sensation that each time I moved, each time I touched something, I was drawing closer to something I couldn't see, but could always feel. Like a presence, a shadow, that followed me wherever I went. It was as if my very existence was becoming part of something darker, something beyond my understanding. I remember the first time it happened. I was sitting at my desk, my fingers brushing the pages of an old book I had found in the attic. The smell of dust and aged paper filled the room, familiar and comforting. But then, as I flipped through the pages, I felt it. A cold, creeping sensation running up my spine, like a hand was resting on the back of my neck. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around, expecting to see something, someone, but the room was empty. The silence hung thick in the air. The faintest sound of breathing seemed to echo in my ears, but I knew it wasn't mine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. A trick of the mind, a fleeting moment of paranoia. But the next time I touched something, anything, a fork, a doorknob, a piece of paper, it was there again. That sense of wrongness, as if I was tethered to something I could never escape. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was in my thoughts, too. A constant hum, a whisper at the back of my mind, telling me that this wasn't just my imagination. It was real. And it was getting stronger. I began to notice little things. At first, it was nothing, just oddities that could easily be explained away. A shadow in the corner of my eye that disappeared when I looked. A flicker of light when the room was completely dark. But the longer it went on, the more these things began to compound, building on top of each other until I could no longer ignore them. The sounds grew louder. At night, I would hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth outside my door. I would get up to check, but there would be nothing, just the empty hallway stretching out before me, quiet and still. I thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I had been working too hard, or maybe it was the isolation getting to me. But then, one night, I touched the doorframe as I was about to step outside. My fingers brushed against the wood, and for a split second, it felt as though something had reached out from the other side, gripping my hand with an unnatural force. The shock of it made my breath catch in my throat, and I quickly pulled my hand back, heart racing. It was then that I realized. It wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't just the house playing tricks on me. The curse was real. Every touch, every step, every breath I took was a part of it. And no matter how hard I tried to escape, no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that my fate had already been sealed. The night after the doorframe incident, I could hardly sleep. My mind raced, my thoughts spinning in circles. What was happening to me? Why was I so sure that this was more than just a feeling? I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that it was just stress, but the truth lingered at the edges of my mind, refusing to be ignored. I tried to focus on the mundane, watching television, reading, even going for walks. But the sensation was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. It was in the way the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, in the way the wind would pick up and howl through the trees outside, as though it carried whispers I couldn't understand. And then, one morning, I woke up to something I couldn't explain. The house was silent, unnervingly so. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind clouded with fear. I had grown accustomed to the strange sounds, the feeling of being watched, but this was different. It was too quiet. And then, I felt it again. That touch. It wasn't a physical touch, not like the others. This was something deeper, something that reached into the very core of my being. It was as if the house itself was pressing in on me, suffocating me with its presence. I tried to move, to get out of bed, but my body felt heavy, paralyzed. My heart raced in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. The feeling that something was watching me, that I was being hunted, grew unbearable. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was the certainty that this was no longer a curse. It was a punishment. And there was no way to stop it. I looked around the room, my eyes desperately scanning for something familiar. But nothing looked the same anymore. The furniture seemed to shift in the dim light, the shadows too dark, the corners too deep. The house had changed. It had become something else, something that was no longer just a place to live, it was a prison. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that this was my life now. Each breath I took, each moment I spent here, was another step toward the inevitable. I was never going to escape. The curse of sensation had claimed me, and there was no way out. The house was quieter than usual the next day. It felt as though the world outside had faded, leaving me isolated in a space that now felt far from safe. I had been trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to me like an invisible shroud, but it was impossible. Every movement seemed deliberate, calculated, like I was being watched from all angles. I forced myself to get out of bed. The light outside was pale, barely penetrating through the curtains. The air was stale, thick with the remnants of the night's tension. It felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. There was no reason for the weight pressing on my chest, no reason for the panic that surged each time I moved. I headed to the kitchen, hoping for some comfort in the normality of making a cup of coffee. The smell of brewing coffee used to calm me, used to anchor me to a routine that felt safe. But today, even that was different. The coffee machine buzzed in the background, but the sound was distorted, like a low hum that scraped at my nerves. I couldn't focus on anything. The room felt too small, the walls closing in. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked behind me. I froze, my hand still gripping the handle of the mug. For a moment, everything went silent. The hum of the coffee machine faded into the background, and all I could hear was my own breath, quick and shallow. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. I blinked, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over me. I was imagining things, I told myself. It was just my mind playing tricks. But then I noticed it, something that made my blood run cold. The door leading to the hallway, which had been closed just moments before, was now slightly ajar. A thin line of darkness stretched across the floor, as if something was peering through the crack. I took a step toward it, my heart hammering in my chest. My feet felt heavy, reluctant to move, as if the very act of walking toward that door would drag me into some unknown nightmare. My breath hitched as I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. I hesitated. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. There was no logical reason for the door to be open. No one had been here, no one had come in. But that crack of darkness, it felt like it was waiting for me. I took a breath and pushed the door open. The hallway was empty, just like the kitchen, but something had shifted. The air felt colder, the light dimmer. The shadows seemed longer, as though they had been stretched by some unseen force. I stepped out into the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the stairs, a figure stood, just out of reach of the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, and shrouded in darkness. I could barely make out its shape, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I took a hesitant step forward, drawn to it, yet terrified of what I might find. But as I moved, the figure didn't change, didn't budge. It remained still, as if frozen in place, and yet I could feel the weight of its gaze upon me. Then it vanished. 1 second, it was there, looming in the corner of my vision, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. My body froze in place, my legs refusing to move. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the empty hallway, wondering if I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The curse, the sensation, had only deepened. It wasn't just a lingering feeling anymore. It had become something real, something that I could no longer deny. I had to get out. I had to escape before it consumed me completely. I spun around, intending to go back to my room, to lock myself away from whatever haunted these walls. But as I turned, something caught my eye. A small object on the floor, half hidden in the shadows. It was a ring. A delicate, silver band, its surface scratched and worn. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I touched the cool metal. It was strange. The ring felt oddly familiar, but I couldn't place where I had seen it before. As I examined it, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. My hands went clammy, and my heart began to race. I didn't know why, but holding that ring made everything feel wrong. And that's when I remembered. It wasn't my ring. It was a piece of jewelry I had seen before. A long time ago, in a place I could barely remember. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. How had it gotten here? How had it found its way into my home? I stood frozen in the hallway, the ring in my hand, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. I wanted to throw it away, but I couldn't. It felt as though the moment I let go, something even worse would happen. But as I stood there, clutching the ring, I heard it again. The creak of floorboards, followed by the sound of something or someone moving behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty once more. But that feeling had returned, stronger than ever. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was in this house with me, something that had been waiting. And it wasn't going to let me leave. Every touch, every moment, Every breath now felt like it was leading me deeper into the curse. The sensation had a name, and I was beginning to understand what it wanted. I wasn't just being haunted. I was being marked. And there was no way out. I could feel the walls pressing in on me. Each breath was more labored than the last, my chest tightening as I stood in the hallway, clutching the ring. The shadows stretched longer, like fingers reaching for me, and the air grew colder still. Every sound felt amplified, my pulse, my breathing, even the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me, lurking, waiting for me to turn around. But I couldn't. My body wouldn't allow it. My legs were like stone, frozen in place as if any movement might trigger some horrific response. The ring in my hand grew heavier with each passing second, the weight of it pressing down on my soul. I didn't understand it, didn't understand why it felt so familiar, why it felt like a tether to something far older than this house. I turned my eyes to the hallway ahead of me, trying to focus on the now empty space. The figure, the one I thought I had seen earlier, was gone. But the shadows lingered, thick and oppressive, as if they held secrets that were just out of reach. I had to get away from it. I had to escape, but the thought of returning to my room felt suffocating. My mind raced, memories flooding back, distant and fleeting. The ring, where had I seen it before? It hit me then. A name. A place. I remembered my grandmother, or at least a hazy image of her. She had lived in a house much like this one, a house with creaky floors and dark corners that seemed to harbor secrets. I hadn't thought about her in years, not since she passed away when I was just a child. But I could clearly recall the small, silver ring she wore on her finger. It looked exactly like the one I was holding. I could even picture the way it shimmered in the dim light of her home. But no! This couldn't be right. I hadn't seen that ring in years. And my grandmother's house, it was far away, long abandoned. She had never come near here. I shook my head, the dizziness creeping up again. Maybe I was losing my mind, or maybe something else was happening. The walls seemed to bend, as though the house itself was warping, twisting the reality around me. I could still feel the eyes on me, watching, following my every movement. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. I needed to go somewhere. Anywhere but here. I stumbled back toward the stairs, feeling an overwhelming need to escape the oppressive atmosphere. But as I moved, I realized something even more unsettling. The door to the living room, which I was certain I had left closed, was now wide open. The room inside was bathed in an unnatural light, and the shadows shifted with a life of their own. My breath caught. I didn't remember opening that door. I didn't remember walking past it at all. As I approached, the silence was deafening, but in the stillness, I thought I heard something, whispers. Low, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from within the room. Help me. The words were faint, but unmistakable. I froze, feeling a wave of cold wash over me. I was sure I hadn't imagined it. Someone, something, was in there. The room was like a void. I could barely make out the shapes of the furniture, but the air inside was thick, suffocating, and somehow colder than the hallway. I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't seem to control my feet. They moved as though they had a mind of their own, pulling me into the room. I stepped across the threshold, and instantly, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around. The room was now darker, the light flickering like a candle on the verge of going out. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were coming from every corner. Help me, help me, help me. I tried to move, to run back to the door, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't turn around. I was rooted to the spot, unable to escape the pressure of the unseen presence pressing in on me. Then, I saw it. In the corner of the room, a figure slowly emerged from the shadows. Its outline was blurred, like a mirage, but I could feel its weight. I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching me, waiting. Its form became clearer, but I could never fully make it out. Its face, if it even had one, was obscured by the darkness that clung to it like a veil. The air around it was thick, heavy, and it smelled of decay. But it wasn't the stench of death I had expected. It was something more subtle, something that seemed to seep into my very bones, filling me with a cold that wasn't natural. "Don't go," the voice whispered, but it wasn't a voice I recognized. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had been lost to time, yet still hungered for the living. My heart pounded in my chest as my body finally obeyed, and I turned to run. My feet were unsteady, my knees weak. I stumbled toward the door, but it was no use. It had vanished, and in its place was an impenetrable wall of shadows. I was trapped. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the walls breathing as if alive. The whispers surrounded me, growing louder, more desperate. And then, amidst the noise, one word broke through, sharp and clear. "Leave." I froze again, every muscle in my body screaming to move, to escape, but I was paralyzed. My hand, still clutching the ring, felt like it was burning against my palm. I looked at it, and for the first time, I saw something in its reflection, a face, pale and distorted, staring back at me from the smooth surface of the silver. I dropped the ring, but it didn't fall. Instead, it hovered in midair, spinning rapidly, as if caught in some invisible force. The room spun with it, the shadows shifting, warping around me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever this was, it wasn't a dream. It was real. And it wasn't going to let me go. The ring floated before me, spinning faster and faster, as if drawn by some invisible force. I could feel the air thickening around me, the oppressive weight of it pressing on my chest. The room was no longer just a room. It was alive in a way that made my skin crawl, the walls seeming to pulse like a beating heart. The whispers had become a cacophony, a dissonant choir of voices all clamoring for attention, filling the room with a suffocating pressure that threatened to break my mind. I reached for the ring, but my hand didn't obey. I tried to move closer, but my body seemed to rebel, each step feeling like I was wading through thick, invisible mud. The very air seemed to resist my movements, pushing me back, preventing me from closing the distance. The whispers turned into words, low and guttural, like ancient incantations. I could make out fragments, pieces of sentences that chilled me to the core. "You are bound to the curse. The past never leaves. It will never end." A sound, sharp and sudden, sliced through the air. It was a scream, but not from me. The room seemed to tremble in response, and the floor beneath my feet shifted as if the house itself was alive. I stumbled, falling to my knees, and that's when I saw it. In the corner, where the shadows had once been an indistinct mass, there was now something more tangible. A figure, tall and thin, its body a twisted silhouette of darkness. It moved slowly, deliberately, each step unnaturally smooth, its limbs extending far longer than they should have been. Its face was a void, no features, no eyes, just a gaping blackness that consumed the light. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath, a mist of condensation in the frozen air. The figure took a step toward me, and the floor creaked under its weight, even though it barely touched the ground. It moved like smoke, flowing rather than walking, its presence sending a wave of nausea through me. I tried to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as though the air itself had turned to stone, suffocating me with its unnatural stillness. I was trapped in a frozen moment, unable to move, unable to escape. "You should never have come here." The figure's voice was not a voice at all. It was a presence, something that filled the room like smoke, wrapping around my mind, choking me with its darkness. The words weren't spoken aloud. They were inside my head, curling around my thoughts, leaving an imprint I couldn't erase. The room began to shift again, the walls stretching and contracting like the ribs of some immense beast. The shadows twisted, contorted into shapes that were almost recognizable, distorted faces, clawing hands, empty eyes. Each shape flickered in and out of existence, too fast for me to comprehend, but I could feel them. I could feel their weight on me, their hunger. I gasped for breath, my chest tightening as the pressure in the room mounted. The shadows were closing in, folding over each other like a web, trapping me in a prison of darkness. I was no longer alone. The presence of the figure was overwhelming, consuming everything in my mind. I could feel it reaching out, like a hand, pulling at my consciousness. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, unified voice. It was coming from everywhere, from the very walls, from the shadows, from the void. The words were no longer fragmented. They were clear. "Leave this place, or become part of it." The room shifted once more, and I found myself no longer in the living room. The walls had disappeared, replaced by an expanse of blackness so deep that I couldn't tell where the floor ended and the sky began. There was no light here, no ground beneath my feet, only an endless abyss. I was falling. No, not falling. I was suspended, drifting in a space that had no definition. The air was thick with the same oppressive energy that had suffocated me in the house. I tried to scream again, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was beginning to fracture, the edges of my reality blurring and warping. In the distance, something shifted. A figure. No, not just a figure. Hundreds of them, thousands, all identical, all reaching out, their long, skeletal hands stretching toward me. Their faces were no faces, just empty voids, like the one that had spoken to me. I tried to back away, but the more I moved, the closer they came. The shadows were alive, crawling toward me like creatures of the dark, filling the space around me, closing in on me. And then, through the chaos, I heard it again. The voice. "You will become one of us. You will never leave." The darkness pressed against me, suffocating, consuming. I could feel my thoughts slipping away, my sense of self disintegrating. The curse was not just in the house, it was in me, in my mind, in my soul. It had been there all along, waiting for me to realize it. I reached for the ring again, but it was gone. It had never been in my hand. It was part of this place, part of this void. It had always been here. I wasn't just trapped in the house. I was trapped in the curse, bound to it by something I didn't understand. And I was never going to escape. The suffocating weight of the void tightened around me. The darkness was no longer just a visual absence. It was a living, breathing entity wrapping itself around my chest, my throat, my mind. I could feel it, the pulse of it, deep inside, like a second heartbeat, quickening with each passing second. The whispers, now deafening, were no longer just words. They were sensations, painful, sharp, curling inside my skin like 1,000 tiny needles pricking me from every angle. I could feel them, those figures, those faceless shapes closing in around me. The black void, the indistinct mass, the endless night, they were all blending together, consuming me whole. There was nowhere to go. There was no escape. The shadows were no longer distant. They were right here, within me, around me, crawling beneath my skin. One of the faceless figures reached out. Its hand was skeletal, unnaturally long, its fingers stretching beyond what should have been possible. It was not a hand meant for a human body. It was something else, something beyond the physical world. It was a presence, not bound by the rules of our reality. Its touch, if you could call it a touch, was like a freezing, jagged pain, something that burned and froze at once. My body jerked involuntarily, but I couldn't move away. The air was thick with resistance, as though the very atmosphere itself was preventing me from breaking free. The figure's touch lingered. It wasn't physical, it was a sensation that dug into my very soul. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, leaving a mark I couldn't see but could feel. It was a curse, a connection that had been forged with each step, with each moment I had hesitated, with every time I had ignored the warning signs. This wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a curse on the house. It was inside me. You are ours now, the voice, an amalgamation of countless others, whispered. Its tone was neither malevolent nor sympathetic, but rather it was flat, an indifferent statement of fact. You have always been ours. The words didn't make sense. They shouldn't have. How could this be? How could I be tied to this? I had only just found myself in this place, in this nightmare. Yet, deep inside, there was a terrible truth that I could no longer ignore. The feeling of being watched, of something always lingering just beyond my perception, was not just paranoia. It was real. The presence had always been there, waiting for me, for the moment I would cross into this cursed space, this threshold. I had been chosen, not for any action of my own, but simply for the fact that I existed. A new wave of cold washed over me, the darkness surrounding me like a living creature, its breath hot and heavy against my skin. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the ground, if you could even call it the ground. The space I had once thought was endless was now compact, like a small, suffocating box, closing in on me. The shadows flickered, becoming more solid, taking form, taking shape. It was as if I were no longer standing in the void, but rather in the remnants of some forgotten world, where the air had turned to dust and the walls of reality had begun to crumble. I could feel the air growing heavier, its thickness smothering me, its density suffocating my every breath. Why? I found myself whispering, the words escaping without my consent. Why me? The faceless figure stepped closer. The dark space around it rippled, as though reality itself was bending to its presence. There was no compassion in the figure's movement, no mercy. It was a force of nature, unstoppable, unrelenting. You do not choose. You never did, the voice answered, this time clearer, more distinct. It was as if the figure itself was speaking through the darkness. You are not here by chance. You were always meant to return. The reality around me shifted again. The endless darkness seemed to fracture, splintering into glimpses of something else, images, flashes of memory that weren't mine. The faces, the hands, the movements, I could see them now, clear as day. They were my memories, but not the way I remembered them. They were twisted, corrupted versions of moments that had once been normal, once had been mundane. Now, they were suffused with fear, with shadows that never existed, with something dark lurking in the background. I couldn't move. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I reached for my chest, trying to hold on to myself, to grasp something that would remind me of who I was before this, before the darkness. But there was nothing. No anchor, no sense of self, no relief. "You cannot leave," the voice said. It was louder now, more insistent, like a warning. "You are already here. You are already bound." I felt it, whatever this curse was, it had taken root inside me. My skin, my flesh, my bones, they weren't mine anymore. They belonged to this place. They belonged to whatever force was controlling this nightmare. My memories were fading, becoming indistinct, blurry. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here, why I had come. Only the sensation remained, the one that had gnawed at my every step, the one that had whispered in the background, reminding me that this was my fate. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg, to cry, to fight back. But those figures, were closing in, their limbs stretching, their faces, though empty, filled with an unknowable hunger. And then, the sensation of touch hit me again. But this time, it wasn't just a figure. It was everything. The air, the shadows, the walls, the ground, it was all alive. It was all reaching for me, suffocating me, pulling me into its dark embrace. I could feel it, the final bond forming. A terrible sense of finality. The curse had always been within me. And now, I would never escape it. I don't know when it started or why it began, but the dreams, they haunt me. They're never the same, yet always feel the same, as if I'm walking through the same foggy corridor every night, unsure of where I'm headed, but terrified to move forward. It was a night like any other when I first heard it. A soft whisper, just at the edge of hearing, like a voice too faint to understand. I lay in my bed, the dim glow of the moon filtering through the curtains, casting shadows on the walls. But it wasn't the shadows that unsettled me, no! It was the sound, the whisper that grew louder the more I tried to ignore it. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away. But it didn't. Instead, it came closer. My heart started to race, my breath quickening as the whisper transformed into something else, something wrong. A footstep. I could almost hear it, slow, deliberate, just outside the door. But when I opened my eyes, there was nothing. No one. Just the usual dark stillness of my bedroom. I turned my head to the clock. The hands read 3:17. I told myself it was nothing, that I had simply imagined it. After all, this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Little things, fleeting moments. A flicker in the corner of my eye. The sense of being watched while I was alone. Nothing I couldn't dismiss. Until now. The footsteps began again. This time, clearer. Slower. Closer. I knew I had to get up, to check. I couldn't let it continue. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet meeting the cold wooden floor with a soft thud. But as soon as my feet touched the ground, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices, overlapping, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle. I felt it then, a presence on the other side, something waiting, watching. But no! I couldn't go there. Not tonight. I stepped back from the door, my back hitting the wall, my breath now coming in shallow gasps. I didn't want to hear it anymore, didn't want to feel it anymore. But it was already too late. The walls of my room began to change. They stretched and warped, twisting in ways that defied reality. The air grew heavier, thick with something I couldn't place, something cold. And then, a shadow moved, too quick to follow, but undeniable. I wasn't alone. I slammed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the images, the sounds, they only grew more intense. There was no escaping it now. I could feel it, right behind me, as real as anything I'd ever known. I opened my eyes just once more, and I saw it. A figure. A face, almost human, but not quite. Its features seemed to shift, like an image flickering on a broken screen, never staying the same. But the eyes, those eyes, they were the only thing that remained. Cold. Empty. Watching me. I wanted to scream. To run. But my body refused to move, frozen in place by fear, by the sheer impossibility of it all. My mind raced, desperate to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. I thought about the stories I'd heard, the legends, the old tales about spirits and nightmares that crossed the line between dream and reality. But those were just stories, weren't they? They had to be. Except this was real. It was happening to me. The figure stepped closer, its presence filling the room like a weight pressing against my chest. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, until one word broke through, clear as day. Run. I didn't run. I couldn't. My legs felt like stone, my body paralyzed by a terror so deep, it was as though I was locked inside my own skin. The figure, no, the thing, loomed before me, its eyes piercing through the shadows like cold steel. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet, there it was, standing in the center of my room, as solid as any person. My breath caught in my throat as I forced myself to step backward, one small movement at a time, as if retreating would somehow make it go away. But the thing didn't move. It only watched. Its face, if it could even be called that, shifted again, morphing, the features bending and twisting in unnatural ways. Its mouth, it wasn't a mouth, not anymore. It was just an opening, dark and endless, as though the thing inside it wanted to consume everything it touched. The whispers grew louder, almost suffocating. I could feel them in my chest, vibrating through my ribs. They weren't words anymore, but a deep, guttural hum that rattled my bones. I thought I might faint from the pressure, but I forced myself to breathe. In. Out. Slowly. Then it happened. The thing, it smiled. Or at least, that's what it seemed like. Its mouth stretched, wider and wider, far beyond what should have been possible. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the room seemed to stretch with me, twisting in ways that defied all logic. The walls closed in. The ceiling tilted. Everything was wrong. It was as if reality itself was being distorted. I turned to run, but I couldn't find the door anymore. I reached for it, my hands grazing the air where it should have been, but it wasn't there. The room, no, this space, was a maze. I was trapped. Get out, the voice hissed, but not in words. It was a command that was felt, deep inside my chest, like something tearing at my insides. I couldn't understand it, but I knew what it meant. I had to leave. I had to escape. But there was no way out. Suddenly, the room went dark. Not just the kind of dark you get when the lights go out, but something deeper, something suffocating. I couldn't see my hands in front of my face. I couldn't hear anything except the rushing of blood in my ears and the erratic beating of my heart. I spun in circles, my mind whirling as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this the dream? Was this all a nightmare? No, this wasn't a dream. I could feel the cold against my skin, the floor beneath my feet, the crushing silence that pressed down on me. A crack of light appeared in the distance. It was faint, but it was enough. I started to run, my feet pounding against the floor, the darkness seeming to swallow me whole with every step I took. The light grew brighter as I drew closer, but just as I reached it, something shifted in the air. The ground beneath me buckled, and I fell to my knees. I couldn't catch my breath, couldn't think straight. I reached for the light, my fingers brushing it, but it slipped away, dissolving like smoke in the air. The figure reappeared, this time looming over me, its presence suffocating. I told you to run, it whispered, the words sharp and cold, like ice. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then it moved. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. It reached for me, and I could feel its fingers graze my arm, a touch that was both freezing and burning at once. I pulled away, but it followed, its grip tightening, dragging me into the darkness. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The whispers filled my mind, each one more frantic than the last. I couldn't escape. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't comprehend. A suffocating pressure that threatened to crush me. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The room, if it could even be called that, was gone. The darkness vanished, and I was back in my bed, covered in cold sweat, my chest heaving with ragged breaths. But it wasn't over. There was something in the room with me. Something that wasn't there before. I glanced toward the door. The faintest trace of a shadow lingered, a shape I knew too well. It was watching me, waiting. And I knew, deep in my gut, that the nightmare wasn't finished yet. I couldn't sleep. Not anymore. I couldn't escape. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I woke up to the feeling of something watching me. My eyes snapped open, but the room was empty, still, the same way it had been before the nightmare began. Yet, I knew deep inside, that the thing I had encountered wasn't just a dream. It had been real, or as real as anything could be when the boundaries of my mind blurred with the waking world. I pushed myself up, my body trembling, and stared at the clock beside my bed. It read 3:45 a.m., the same time as before. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Why 3:17? Why that exact time, and why had the figure waited until then to make its presence known? I glanced around the room again, hoping the suffocating darkness had left, but there was no sign of the shadow that had haunted me. No eerie whispers. No unnatural cold. But the silence felt wrong, like it was hiding something, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The faint scent of something metallic lingered in the air. Blood? No, it couldn't be. I shook my head and stood up, trying to clear the haze of fear clouding my thoughts. The floor creaked under my feet as I moved toward the window, the only source of light in the room now that the moon had moved behind a cloud. I opened the blinds, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty street below. Nothing unusual. Just the usual quiet of the neighborhood at night. But as I stared into the darkness beyond the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stepped back, my heart racing as the thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't just in my dreams? What if it was always there, following me, watching me? I shook my head again, trying to force the thought out of my mind. I couldn't think like that. I couldn't. But I couldn't deny the feeling that something was wrong, something was off. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. And then, the whispers returned. I froze. This time, they weren't distant, muffled sounds from the corner of my mind. No, they were here, right in front of me, like they were coming from within the very walls. Low, guttural murmurs, rising and falling like waves crashing against the shore. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The message was clear. I wasn't alone. I backed away from the window, my mind racing as I tried to understand what was happening. What did it want? Why me? Why now? I turned and looked toward the door, my body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The house was silent again, but I knew better. I wasn't safe. Not anymore. The moment I moved to leave the room, the temperature dropped. I felt at first a chill that seeped into my bones, cold enough to make my breath visible in the air. I stopped in my tracks, and that's when I heard it. The sound of something scraping against the floor, a slow, deliberate motion, like nails being dragged across the surface. I spun around, searching the room. There was nothing. Nothing but the shadows, deep and still, as if they were waiting for me to make the next move. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the room. Just beyond the reach of the dim light, barely visible, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing on my chest. It wasn't the same figure from my dream, but it was close. The same unsettling shape. The same hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I was frozen, unable to break free from the grip of terror that held me in place. It took a step forward, and I could feel the air shift as it moved, the shadows stretching to embrace it. It was here. Again. Why are you here? I whispered, my voice shaking with fear. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat deafening in the quiet room. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, unmoving, silent. But its presence was enough. I knew it was waiting for something, something I wasn't prepared to face. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. The dreams, the figure, the whispers. It was all too much. I had to escape. I had to leave this place. But the house was changing. The walls seemed to shift while I wasn't looking, and the air smelled different, like decay, like something old and forgotten. It wasn't just the figure I had to worry about anymore. It was the house itself, and whatever was inside it that was waking up. I turned to leave the room, my feet moving automatically, but as I reached for the door, something slammed into me from behind. A force so powerful it knocked me to the ground. I twisted around, panic rising in my throat. But there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows. But the whispers were growing louder. They were no longer words. They were screams. Screams of terror, of pain. And they were coming from the walls. From the floor. From every corner of the room. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape it. I slammed my hands over my ears, but the sound was inside my head now, echoing in my mind like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard it again. Run. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back as I ran, not daring to glance at the shadows, not daring to face whatever waited behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a shock, the world around me silent once more. But even then, I could feel it. That sense of being watched. That feeling that I wasn't alone. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the nightmare wasn't over. The cold night air didn't bring relief. If anything, it made everything worse. The silence outside was too deep, too unnatural. I stood on the porch, my breath visible in the chill, eyes scanning the darkness as if the shadows were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. It felt like the house was breathing, like it was alive. I could feel the weight of it pressing on me, even though I was standing outside, far from the rooms that had seemed so much darker just moments before. The figure, the thing that had been inside, wasn't gone. It was still with me. I could feel its presence like a shadow at the edge of my vision, never fully gone, just waiting for the right moment to strike again. I glanced back at the house, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. Not yet. It felt like a trap, one that I couldn't see until it was too late. But I had to figure this out. I couldn't just run forever. I turned away from the house, my feet carrying me down the steps, toward the street. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch too far, too eagerly, reaching toward me. I didn't know where I was going. My mind was still reeling from what had happened, what was happening, and I needed to get away. I could hear the faint sound of my footsteps on the pavement, nothing else. No cars. No distant voices. Just the sound of my heart hammering in my chest, loud and relentless. Then came the sound. It was subtle at first. A faint creaking, like wood bending under pressure, followed by something much heavier, something dragging along the ground, slow and deliberate. I stopped. The sound was coming from behind me. From the house. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. No figure. No shadow. Just the house, standing silent and still. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. It was just my mind playing tricks. Just the stress. The fear. But the sound persisted. It grew louder. Closer. Like something was slowly crawling toward me. I turned again, scanning the street, trying to shake the dread gnawing at my insides. There had to be a rational explanation for this. There had to be. But then, a whisper. A voice, faint but unmistakable, rising from behind me. Come back. I froze. The voice wasn't just in my ears. It was inside my head. It was as if the words were wrapping around my brain, squeezing until I couldn't think. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look. But I did. There, at the edge of the yard, in the shadows just outside the streetlight's reach, stood the figure. It wasn't as solid as before. It was flickering, like an old film reel that had been damaged, the edges of its shape warping and distorting with every blink. I could see it now, fully. Its face was almost human, but the eyes, those eyes weren't. They were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to drink in the light, swallowing it whole. I could hear its breath now, slow and labored, like it was struggling to exist. The sound of it was all around me, filling the empty space. I wanted to run, to flee, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look away. Come back, it whispered again, the voice slithering into my mind. The air felt thick with it, choking me with the promise of something I couldn't understand. But I knew it was a lie, a trick. It wanted me to return to the house. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step back, then another, my heart pounding with a fear I had never known. The figure didn't move, but its presence pressed down on me, suffocating, urging me to turn around, to come back. But I couldn't. Not after everything. Not after the way it had twisted my world, made me question what was real. My mind raced, thinking of a way out. Of something, anything, that could give me an escape. I glanced around. The street was empty. I was alone. I had to move. I turned away from the figure, my feet finally obeying, carrying me down the road, away from the nightmare that I could feel chasing me in the darkness. But just as I thought I had escaped it, as I thought I was safe, I heard it again. The whisper. Run. It was louder this time, closer, right behind me. My pulse quickened, and I turned my head, expecting to see the figure. But it wasn't there. And then I heard the dragging sound again. It was too close now, too loud, like the thing was right behind me, just out of sight. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. My legs burned as I pushed myself faster, the streetlights blurring past me, the darkness pressing in. But the sound kept coming. Closer. Closer. And then it stopped. Dead silence. I dared to glance over my shoulder. The street was empty. The figure, the whispers, they were gone. For now. But I knew it wouldn't be for long. It never was. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The fear was too strong. The need to escape it all was too powerful. But as I rounded the corner, something stopped me cold. There, on the pavement in front of me, was something small. Something shiny. A broken ring. The same one I had thrown away in the woods. I knelt down slowly, my hand trembling as I picked it up. The cold metal felt like ice against my skin, and a sick realization twisted in my gut. It was the same one. I hadn't imagined it. I wasn't just being watched. I was being followed. The broken ring lay heavy in my hand, the weight of it pulling me down, dragging me back into the nightmare I had been trying to escape. I stared at it for a long moment, the cold metal gleaming under the faint streetlight, as though mocking my desperate need for answers. How could it be here? How could it have come back? I had thrown it far away, deep into the woods, as far from me as I could. But somehow, it was here. In front of me. As if the darkness had decided to play its cruel game with me, making sure I could never truly escape. I clutched the ring tightly, feeling the sharp edges press against my palm, and my mind raced with a million thoughts, none of them making sense. Was this a message? A warning? Or just another piece of the twisted puzzle that had been my life for the past few weeks? I could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, the sound pulling me from my spiraling thoughts. The night was still, too still. There was something wrong with the air, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned, ready to leave, ready to run, but then, there it was again. The whisper. Come back. I froze. The voice wasn't just in the air this time, it was inside my head, crawling through my thoughts, twisting them into knots. It was almost like I could feel it on my skin, brushing against me, cold and insistent. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I spun around, searching the darkness for the source. But the street was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should have, pulling away from the light, as if the night itself was hungry for me. The air shifted, colder now, and I could feel something close by, close enough to make my skin crawl. The figure. I didn't need to see it to know it was there. I could feel its presence, like a dark cloud hanging over me, threatening to suffocate me with its weight. I glanced down at the ring again, the cold metal burning against my skin, and suddenly, I knew. I couldn't run. Not anymore. I had to face it. Whatever this was, whatever this nightmare had become, I couldn't escape it. The figure appeared in front of me without warning. It didn't emerge from the shadows. It didn't move in a way I could understand. One moment, it wasn't there, and the next, it was. Flickering, like an image on an old TV screen, unstable and torn. Its face, or what should have been its face, was still the same, hollow eyes, twisted mouth that stretched far beyond what a human mouth should have been able to do. It tilted its head, watching me with those empty, void-like eyes, and the whispering began again. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was many, hundreds, thousands, rising and falling in a cacophony of sound, filling the air with their screeching, tortured tones. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. It was like the air itself had swallowed my words, like the very act of resistance was useless in the face of this thing. Why? I finally managed, my voice shaking as I took a step back. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel it, feel its intent. The message was clear. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to have found out whatever this was. But I had, and now there was no going back. The whispers grew louder, the voices blending together in a frantic chorus that clawed at my mind, urging me to follow them, to go wherever they wanted me to go. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I stumbled, desperate to break free of its hold, but the world around me twisted, warped. The street, the houses, the trees, they all started to bend, stretching and curling in unnatural ways. I turned, desperate for an escape, but the figure was there again, standing in front of me, blocking my path. Its hollow eyes seemed to see through me, to my very soul. I could feel it, feel its hunger. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The earth cracked open, like the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. I screamed, trying to steady myself, but there was no solid ground to hold onto anymore. I fell. And just as I hit the ground, I heard it again, the whisper, as if it was inside my very bones. Welcome home. It started with a question that I couldn't ignore. Why do we feel so small in the face of nature's vastness? Why does the sound of water, gentle as it may be, hold so much weight? It was the end of a long day, the kind that seemed to drag on forever, pulling at my mind until everything felt numb. The world had been heavy, full of stress and worries that I couldn't escape. The air around me had felt thick, like I was breathing through a fog, and I needed something, anything, to break the weight of it all. So, I found myself sitting beside the river. The water flowed quietly in front of me, its surface calm, almost serene, but I could feel something else in the air, something hidden just beneath the tranquility. The kind of stillness that wasn't quite peaceful but felt more like a warning. I tried to shake the unease, forcing myself to focus on the sound of the river. It was soothing, a gentle rush of water over rocks, the sound that always calmed my nerves. But as I sat there, the world around me seemed to close in. The trees stood too still, their branches barely moving in the wind. The leaves didn't rustle the way they should have. Then, as if it had always been there. I heard it. The faintest whisper, barely more than a breath. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. No, this was something else. I leaned in closer, straining to hear. It was coming from the water. I looked down at the stream, the ripples barely disturbing the surface, but the sound, it was unmistakable. The river was speaking to me. Not in words, but in a melody. A soft, haunting hum that sent a shiver crawling down my spine. Help us, the water seemed to say, the voice quiet but urgent. It wasn't the voice of a person. It was deeper, older, like the sound of forgotten souls rising from the depths of the earth. I tried to stand, to leave, but something held me there. I couldn't look away. My eyes locked onto the river, as if something within it was calling to me, something I couldn't quite understand. I could feel my heart racing now. The whisper grew louder, clearer, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the water. It was something else. Something I couldn't explain. I took a step back, my breath shallow. The water seemed to shimmer in the fading light, almost as though it was alive, twisting with an energy I couldn't comprehend. And the voices, they weren't just whispers anymore. They were calling, chanting. Faint, but undeniable. I looked around. No one else was there. Just me and the river. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to listen, to understand. I leaned forward again, my fingers brushing the cool surface of the water. It was colder than I expected, colder than it should have been. My hand recoiled instinctively, but not before I felt something. A subtle pressure, like a hand brushing against mine. Come closer, the water seemed to whisper again. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The whispers turned into something else. Something darker. The voices were no longer pleading, they were demanding. I couldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, caught in the pull of the river's quiet power. The trees, the rocks, the sky, they all blurred around me. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was hearing, what I was feeling. Was I hearing things? Was this just exhaustion, my mind playing tricks on me after such a long day? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The river was alive with something ancient, something forgotten. And as the sun dipped lower, casting shadows that stretched too far, I felt a cold hand wrap around my heart, squeezing it in warning. The voices in the water grew louder, no longer whispers, but full-throated cries. I had to leave. I had to run. But before I could, I felt it again. That subtle pressure, like fingers brushing against my skin. And then, nothing. Silence. The whispers stopped. The air cleared. The tension that had held the world in place seemed to vanish. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A shape in the water. Dark, fluid, shifting like a shadow that didn't belong. I blinked, and it was gone. But I could still hear it. The silent stream. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. As I stumbled away from the river, my eyes kept flicking back, drawn to the water's edge. There was a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. But I couldn't see anyone, nothing moved, nothing made a sound. The world had returned to its unnerving silence. The trees were still, the air oddly thick. But it didn't feel like peace. It felt like the calm before a storm. As I walked back through the narrow path that cut through the woods, the sounds of the forest began to press in on me. Birds, insects, even the rustle of leaves, they were all gone. The silence was deafening. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, the weight of it all settling in my chest, suffocating me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding harder now, and yet, no matter how fast I moved, it felt like the forest was closing in around me. The shadows stretched long, even though the sun was still high enough in the sky. It was like they were reaching for me, trying to pull me back into the woods, back toward the river. When I finally emerged from the trees, I expected to see the familiar sights of the town, but instead, the world around me felt off-kilter. The houses, the streets, everything was wrong. The air tasted different, too, heavier, thicker. Like it had been soaked in the same strange energy that clung to the river. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread that clung to me. I was tired, that's all. I had been pushing myself too hard lately, overthinking everything. I needed rest. I didn't believe in things like this. Ghosts. Spirits. Whispers in the wind. I wasn't that person. And yet, here I was, questioning the very air around me. I decided to try and push through it. I tried to focus on something normal, something grounding. I walked into the local cafe, hoping for a cup of coffee to clear my head. The sound of the door opening was loud against the silence that pressed down on me. Inside, the cafe was its usual warm, cozy self. The smell of fresh coffee, the soft murmur of conversation, it was the kind of place that always made me feel at ease. But today, the atmosphere felt heavy, stifling. I sat down, hoping the mundane would bring me back to my senses. But then, I heard it again. A faint whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. I froze, my body stiffening as I tried to locate the source of the sound. It wasn't coming from the person sitting across from me, who was quietly sipping their coffee, oblivious to my rising panic. No one else seemed to notice. The whisper grew louder, though, and I realized it was coming from the corner of the cafe. I looked, and for a split second, I thought I saw the shadow of something. A flicker. It was gone before I could really focus, but it felt like it was there. It felt like something was waiting. Watching. "Are you all right?" The barista's voice startled me, her hand hovering near the coffee cup. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. "Just tired," I managed to say, though my voice felt thin, distant. Like it wasn't my own. The barista smiled and walked away, but my mind was elsewhere. The whispers. The shadow. That feeling I couldn't explain. It was all tied back to the river. I knew it. But why? What was it trying to tell me? I couldn't keep pretending. I had to go back. I had to understand. I left the cafe without another word. The streets seemed longer on my walk back. The familiar houses now felt foreign, strange, and when I reached the woods, my footsteps faltered. The path seemed darker, though the sun hadn't set yet. The shadows between the trees stretched too far. I didn't want to go back to the river. I didn't want to face whatever it was that had been calling to me. But I couldn't stop myself. The pull was too strong. When I arrived, the water was still. But the moment I stepped closer, I felt it, the same oppressive weight in the air. The same pull that had gripped me earlier. It wasn't the wind this time, it wasn't the rustling of the trees. It was something deeper. I knelt down at the water's edge, staring into its depths. The surface shimmered under the dimming light, but there was something beneath it, something hidden just out of sight. I could almost hear the voices again, soft and indistinct, rising from the darkness below. I leaned in closer, and for the first time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. Not quite human. Not quite anything I could name. It was like a shadow, but it moved. It twisted in the water like a living thing, its form constantly shifting. A face, but not a face, just a distortion, a hollow space where something should be. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back, heart pounding. The whispers turned into something else. Something darker. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, I heard it, louder now, clearer than ever. A voice, not from the river, but from behind me, in the very air around me. Come closer. I froze. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the trees. And the river, still as ever, calling to me. The voice had felt too close, like someone was whispering directly into my ear. But when I turned, there was nothing. The forest was still, the air thick with tension. My heart thumped loudly in my chest, drowning out the rustling of the leaves. For a moment, I stood frozen, trying to catch my breath. I could still feel the weight of the voice on me, pressing in like invisible hands. I didn't know if I was imagining things or if something had truly spoken. The river's surface shimmered under the fading light, almost like it was trying to pull me back in. I shook my head. No. I had to be losing it. My mind had been working overtime. The last few days had been grueling. Maybe the stress was catching up to me. I had to get away from this place, from the river. But even as I thought that, I couldn't bring myself to leave. It was like the river had a hold on me, a magnetic pull that was impossible to ignore. My feet felt heavy, unwilling to move away from its edge. I backed away slowly, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, making sure nothing was lurking in the shadows. My pulse was racing, but there was no sound of footsteps following me, no hint of movement. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I kept walking, the air around me growing colder as I moved deeper into the woods. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something else. A presence, a sense that I wasn't alone. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The distant call of an owl. But there was nothing more than that. I finally reached the main trail that led back into town. The road felt like an anchor, something familiar that could pull me back into a sense of normalcy. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it didn't last. The whispers, that nagging feeling, still lingered in the back of my mind. The thought of returning to the safety of my apartment was almost comforting, but there was something inside me, something deep in my gut, that told me it wouldn't be enough. I made my way home, moving quickly, almost too quickly, as if I were running from something invisible. As soon as I reached my door, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it with a shaky hand. I leaned against it for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know what was happening to me. I glanced around the apartment. Everything was in its place. Nothing had changed. But the sense of unease hadn't gone away. It felt like the very walls were closing in on me. I needed to be calm, to think rationally, but my mind kept circling back to that voice, to the figure in the water. I took a deep breath and forced myself to sit down on the couch. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for something to happen. I needed to focus. I needed to figure out what was really going on. I had always been a skeptic, never believed in the supernatural or any of that nonsense. But now, after everything I'd experienced, I wasn't so sure. The river had done something to me. It had changed something, awakened something in me. I could feel it. It was like the quiet whisper of the water had slipped inside my mind and was burrowing deeper with each passing minute. I stood up abruptly, my hands trembling as I moved toward the window. I had to see it again. I had to understand it. I threw open the blinds, my eyes immediately drawn to the darkening river that ran parallel to the town. The fading light cast strange shadows across its surface, making the water look like a dark, moving abyss. The stillness was unnerving. No birds, no wind. Only silence and the whispering sound of the water. That's why I saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker, a dark shape just beneath the surface. But then it moved, shifting with a fluidity that made my stomach churn. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't the current. It was something else. I pressed my hand to the glass, my breath fogging up the window as I stared, transfixed. The shape was growing, elongating, like something was reaching toward the surface. My heart stopped as a face began to form. Not a human face, not exactly, but something twisted and wrong. Hollow eyes, a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide. It was like looking at something that shouldn't exist. The figure was half submerged, as if waiting for the right moment to rise completely from the water. I pulled back, stumbling away from the window as if the very sight of it might drag me in. My head was spinning. I couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in on me, suffocating me. I had to get out. I had to leave. But then came the knock. Soft, steady, almost gentle. I froze, my blood running cold. It came again, louder this time. Someone, or something, was at my door. The knock echoed through the apartment like a hammer. I stood there, frozen, my heart racing in my chest. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but my feet were cemented to the floor. Slowly, I moved toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Who could it be? No one had come to visit me for days, weeks even. I hadn't told anyone where I was going earlier. And no one else knew about the river, about what I had experienced. It was only me. But the knock came again, and this time it was louder, more insistent. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I shouldn't open the door. I knew I shouldn't, but something inside me urged me to do it. I had to know. I had to see what was out there. I gripped the doorknob and turned. The door swung open, but there was no one standing there. The hallway outside was empty, just the dim, flickering light from a single bulb casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stepped cautiously into the hallway. I looked left. I looked right. Nothing. I closed the door behind me, my mind racing. Was I hallucinating? Was this some twisted part of the stress I had been under? I couldn't tell anymore. The line between reality and whatever was happening had blurred, and it was becoming harder and harder to separate the two. But as I turned to head back inside, I saw it. A single, dark shape in the corner of my eye, lingering just outside the range of the hallway light. I turned, my heart jumping into my throat. It was a shadow. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the dim light, its shape barely visible in the darkness. But I knew it wasn't a person. The air grew colder, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The whispering sound I had heard at the river was back, only now it was louder. It was closer. The sound of water flowing, the faintest murmur of voices, all pressing in around me like 1,000 unseen whispers. I could feel the thing in the shadow, watching me. I wasn't sure if I wanted to run or if I wanted to confront it. Something pulled me forward, though, like an invisible thread guiding me toward the shadow. With every step, the whispering grew louder, clearer. It was almost like it was speaking to me now, calling my name. Evan. I froze. It was my name. There was no mistaking it. I hadn't imagined it. Someone, something, had spoken my name. The shadow shifted, and for a moment, I thought it was going to step into the light. But then it was gone. Just like that. I stood there for a long time, my breath shallow and quick, the silence almost suffocating. My legs felt like lead. I couldn't move, couldn't think. What was going on? And then I heard it again. The sound of water. The same quiet, unsettling whisper. I turned back toward my apartment door, desperate to get inside, away from whatever had just been standing in that hallway. As I reached for the handle, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. And there it was. The figure, standing at the door, blocking my way in. It was still shrouded in darkness, but I could feel its presence. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch and sway with the slightest movement. Its head hung low, the face hidden in shadow. But I knew it was watching me. I took a step back, my pulse thundering in my chest. The whispering grew louder, now unmistakable. Evan, the voice was clear now, almost pleading. Come closer. I shook my head, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. I slammed the door shut between us, my hands trembling as I locked it. I backed away, the sounds of the river in my mind, the quiet whispers still echoing through my ears. I stumbled into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, gasping for breath. What was happening? Why did it know my name? I tried to calm myself, but the images were already flooding in. The dark shape at the river. The twisted face I had seen under the water. The thing in the hallway. My mind raced with questions I didn't want the answers to. I looked around, desperate for something familiar, something to ground me in reality. But nothing felt real anymore. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in on me, the air thick and heavy, as though I were suffocating. The door. I had to check the door again. I jumped to my feet, my breath shallow. I needed to know. I approached it cautiously, not daring to touch the handle at first. And when I finally did, my heart nearly stopped. The door was warm. Too warm. I opened it slowly, almost afraid to see what was on the other side. And there it was again, just outside the door, a small, wet footprint leading down the hall. It was like the river had followed me inside. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, constricted by something I couldn't see but knew was there. The warm, damp footprint on the floor seemed to pulse under my gaze, as though it was alive, watching me. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing, scrambling for any explanation that made sense. But none came. This wasn't normal. It couldn't be. I backed away from the door, my legs shaky beneath me, my head spinning. The whispering had stopped, but its presence hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The apartment felt wrong, every corner too shadowed, every sound too sharp. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in, drawn tighter by some unseen force. The walls, no, the floor. The dampness, the coldness creeping up the sides of the room. It was everywhere now, seeping into the very fabric of the apartment. I turned, stumbling back toward the couch, my hands gripping the armrests to steady myself. The air around me felt too thick, too heavy. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let whatever this was follow me any further. But as I tried to stand, a low hum filled the space. It was distant at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder. It was a deep, vibrating sound, like the steady rush of water flowing beneath the surface. The river was calling to me again. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the hum grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just in my head. It was everywhere, a presence that surrounded me, pressing into my skin. I stood up, my pulse racing as I moved toward the window. The street below looked calm, too calm. There was no sign of the usual bustle of people or cars. Just an eerie, unsettling stillness. As if the world outside had been swallowed up by the same quiet dread that had taken over my apartment. I turned away from the window, my mind spinning. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The river would follow me, wherever I went. I felt its pull in my bones, its call deep in my soul, like a tide I couldn't resist. A sudden flash of movement caught my eye, and I spun around. There, in the corner of the room, was the shadow again. It wasn't like the figure in the hallway. This one was smaller, crouching, its features obscured by the darkness, but the sense of malevolence was the same. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. And then, in that same whispering voice, it spoke again. "Come closer, Evan." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating off the walls, filling the space. The voice was distorted now, warped as though it came from deep beneath the earth. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voice was inside me now, swirling around my thoughts, twisting them, making everything feel alien. Everything felt wrong. I opened my eyes again, and the shadow was gone. I blinked, shaking my head, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind couldn't keep up with it anymore. I needed to get out. But where could I go? There was no escape from this. No escape from the river, from the thing that had followed me here. And then, as if it had heard my thoughts, the river spoke again. A soft, faint sound, almost like a sigh, came from the far corner of the room, as though the air itself was shifting, like the water was moving through the very walls. I didn't even know what I was doing anymore. My legs carried me toward the door, toward the sound. But I was no longer sure if I was moving toward it or away from it. Every step felt like it was pulling me deeper into something I didn't understand, something I couldn't escape. The whispers had returned, but now they were clearer, more distinct. I could hear them in my ears, in my mind. I could hear the voices of the lost souls, of the forgotten things that had once been human. "Evan, come closer." The temperature dropped suddenly, the air turning frigid, and I could see my breath in the dim light. I reached for the door again, but the handle was hot to the touch, burning my skin as I pulled it open. Outside, the world had changed. The city street was gone, replaced by the dense, dark woods that surrounded the river. The trees were tall and gnarled, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The river was there, just as I had seen it before. The same murky, black water flowed quietly beneath the bridge. But now, the whispers were louder, more urgent, the current pulling at my very soul. I took a step forward. I didn't know why, but I was drawn to it, as if the river itself had a claim on me. I took another step, and then another. The whispering reached a crescendo, and I could hear it clearly now. Evan, it's time. I was standing at the edge of the river, the water rushing by beneath me. The moonlight reflected off the surface, casting a ghostly glow on the ripples. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible splash. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, but I was alone. The woods were silent, except for the water. It was calling me. I stepped closer to the edge. I had to know. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.